I'm very pleased to be welcoming you delegates to the ICOMOS Conference on Cultural Heritage, Communities and Climate Crisis. As the patron of ICOMOS-UK, I regret being unable to play a full part in the proceedings, but I'm delighted to congratulate the organisers for having identified the problem and found exemplars of how our members could add their varied skills to boosting the solutions to problems only as yet partly understood. ICOMOS is composed mostly of professionals involved in the protection and preservation of our built cultural heritage. But when it comes to climate change, it is timely to look back at our history to the period when wanting to preserve historic buildings was considered an eccentric personal choice. It was only when antiquarians were able to demonstrate that there were discernible streams in the history of architecture that people understood why we should look to the past and appreciate what our predecessors had bequeathed to us. The conservation of the past became more than just the personal taste of individuals, but public support could be demonstrated by such bodies as the National Trust, the Georgian Society, the Victorian Society, and the legal sanctions initiated by Lord Curzon. Very quickly, it was shown that local committees could use academic arguments to support their love of local buildings and to move arguments beyond the more economic into the political field. Climate change discussions have now reached a similar stage, and the political implications of motivating communities into better reactions than motorway demonstrations are here for us to learn about and to see the next steps. I hope all of you will find the time spent today of significance and will find that the consequence will be progress both for leadership roles and for public support. I wish you all the best outcome.
Good morning, everybody. It's absolute great privilege to be here with so many international top players in the world of culture that really underpins who we are as human beings. My name is Laura Sands, and I'm the joint chair of the Environmental Justice Commission, which has been developed by the Institute of Public Policy Research. We've been doing a huge amount of work across the country in the UK, but hopefully drawn on quite a lot of international examples of how we ensure that we deliver a just transition. I'm also extremely proud to be Vice President of Civic Voice, which is the, in many ways, the citizens' voice when it comes to culture, heritage, and preservation of many of our key buildings in the UK, and work closely with them on many policies in order to protect our culture. So I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about climate change. I don't think I need to explain to anybody here that time is running out. And we can see that from around the world, lots of disasters, the increase, the dynamism of those disasters. But in some ways, the debate is sort of changing from, let's say, the decarbonisation of big stuff like our electricity system to actually now starting to, in many ways, touch human beings, really impact the way we live, both from a climate perspective, but also from a risk and natural hazards perspective. So I think we're moving into a different era where it's going to be people who are at the heart of some of the solutions, but also the problems. So just think about your area and think about what are the drivers of climate change, all of these key issues, whether it be temperature in oceans, snow cover, or desertification of many parts of our globe. this is starting to have a very significant impact on how people live, how people survive, how people have to adapt their current way of working, and also human beings' interaction with the natural world. I don't think that we can overstress the issue around nature as being one of the key drivers, not just of our survival, but our culture, the way we live, the way we act. So I think we can all identify with some of these metrics, and these are the key drivers and the key sort of indicators of where climate change is. But what on earth has culture got to do with this? Well, I think we're all listening to this webinar absolutely believe that culture is actually at the heart of who we are as people. It's the nature of who we are, and it absolutely is crucial when dealing with such systemic change and threat. You also know that you actually connect communities, and that is going to be absolutely crucial. You connect communities not in a political or in a religious or in a sort of structured way, but in an emotional way, which is going to be absolutely crucial going forward. And you can be a driver of community action. So I think that culture has been very overlooked when it comes to dealing with climate change, but absolutely needs to start to get its voice heard. So why do you matter? You do touch people in a very different way, touch people that will be impacted by climate change. You know about what is at risk, people's culture, their environments. I mean, the displacement issues impacting traditions and rituals. These are not trivial matters. So you are absolutely, as a community, as a global community, absolutely at the front line of protecting and speaking on behalf of these less obvious risks that in many ways policymakers have not engaged with yet. And the reality of 1.5 degrees, that is what we need to achieve. But even the realities of 1.5 degrees will require us, obviously, to do a huge amount of mitigation. But I see that much more in what I would call the public policy space. But I do see our role as cultural leaders to look at the adaptation issues and also the protection of culture as we go through this change. So what does 1.5 degrees mean? It will be dramatic. I personally believe that, and it's already happening, Indigenous people's culture is already being wiped out, and so many more Indigenous people's way of life is being threatened. We will have to change our ways of living. Now, that's a very, very important cultural issue. I mean, even if you just take the issue around food, that has very, very deep cultural links. As we talked about, nature will be significantly impacted. Cultural buildings will be threatened. And really frighteningly, in many ways, displacement will destroy communities and their connectivity. And that connectivity is what culture builds and in many ways amplifies. So let me propose to you what maybe your next steps are. I would be absolutely clear that it is our role as people in culture to look at who and what is most at risk. So in your areas, audit what is going to be at risk, whether it be communities and their culture, whether it be cultural buildings, whether it be the ways of life that absolutely bind our cultures together and our communities together. So I think it's our role to actually identify what is at risk in what might be perceived by policymakers as being soft issues. We as cultural leaders must be authentic. It's far too often that in some ways cultural elites or metropolitan type people actually determine policy and action on behalf of others. And that's why, and what we learned through the IPPR Commission, absolutely crucial. We need to listen. listen much harder and learn, because it is our communities who will actually have some of the answers to some of these extremely difficult questions. So I would absolutely urge you, let's not sit at the sidelines as a cultural community. Let's absolutely ensure that we get into the game and start playing and start making sure our voice matters. I think that there's too often that we as a community feel quite diffident about getting involved in these big macro issues. But we are absolutely at the heart of both protecting some of the most important human factors, those of culture, but also we are actually an agent of change, an agent that can actually bring those communities together. So please don't step back, step into this debate, and don't let yourself and the cultural dimensions of what is going to have to happen be left on the other side of the door. So as I say, please don't let the door be slammed in your face. It is really up to us to move onto the pitch and to ensure that communities' voices are heard. We learned a lot from the IPPR, and maybe some of these learnings are useful for you. Climate change actually, while a very systemic problem, is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to shape things differently, and in many ways to look at fairness as a key driver of policy. We must take a people first approach, and that's where the cultural community is incredibly important. We do need national leadership, but it's actually going to be location by location that is going to shape in many ways many of these solutions. And you have tentacles into every community, into every local area, and understand what binds those areas together. It is not just going to be, the current silos of policy, and that's where we need to ensure that our voice is heard. It is a whole economy, all society approach. And recognize what we recognized was that the public sometimes don't necessarily grasp the whole dimensions of climate change, but they absolutely engage on nature. Nature is going to be a key driver of, in many ways, behavior change and also community action. So please ensure that you're constantly making that message very, very clear. So there is much to protect, and our culture can bind communities. We have got wonderful cultural links and cultural diversification across the globe. What we don't want to do is to drive migration and to, in many ways, break down those very, very important linkages. Nature, as I say, is an absolutely crucial factor, and we're going to find communities and culture eroded by a lot of natural phenomena that will come with even 1.5 degrees. I think you've got a huge role when it comes to bringing everyone pulling in the same direction, not in different directions, and can play as change agents for communities who might have been divided. And of course, religion actually plays an important part here, about interfaith, about creating commonality and not allowing, in many ways, religion to become a dividing line rather than a unifying line. So I hope that what we've done today is highlight some of the roles that culture can play, that you actually are agents of change. You're not sitting at the sidelines. It's absolutely crucial, the role that you can play to bind communities, to deliver a really, really clear community and citizen-wide message to policymakers, as you are an agent of change, but also an agent for communities to ensure their voice is heard and that they are not left out of this absolutely crucial journey that we're on. I want to thank you all so much. I know you've got a fantastic day ahead, and I know that there are lots of different perspectives that you'll be hearing from. All I want to say and all I want to believe in is that we in the cultural community matter, and the people that we represent truly matter. Thank you very much indeed.
I'd like to now move on to the next speaker, who's James Ritson. Dr. James Ritson is an architecturally trained building conservator specializing in sustainability and recording the existing built environment. He's currently the program leader for both BSc Honours and MSc Building Surveying at University College of Estate Management. He's expert member of 2 ICOMOS committees. I'm not going to go into detail, and also scientific committees. And he's the vice president of the International Scientific Committee on Energy and Sustainability. His main research interests are sustainability of the existing built environment, the recording of existing buildings. He's going to talk about, he's going to question whether trying to make historic building zero carbon is the most sustainable approach. Should there be a different approach? I'd like to now hand over to James. He's here in person. Can we have James, please? Thank you, James.
Thank you, Clara. I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get the presentation started. You should be able to see my screen now. Are we all clear? Yep.
Yeah, we see a black screen, but yes.
Is it clear now?
Not yet.
Haven't got an image.
Okay, we have it now. Thank you, James.
Okay. So, technical issues aside, thank you so much, Clara, for what a lovely introduction. My name is Dr. James Ritson, and I specialise in looking at ways of making the existing built environment more sustainable. I'm going to question today, what is zero carbon the ultimate focus for creating a sustainable historic built environment? My name is Dr. James Ritson, and for about 15 years now, I've been specialising in trying to find sustainable solutions to existing buildings, in particular historic buildings and sites, so cities as well. And that's involved me working a lot with community groups, whether they be local churches, local housing groups, neighbourhood teams, wanting to know how they can improve the sustainability of their historic buildings, all the way through to some of the largest and grandest buildings in the UK. I was made Vice President of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Energy and Sustainability last year. And from there, we've been working not only on the very important area of climate change, but also on the wider spheres of the other sustainable issues. And I think those need to be need to be brought into focus while we're dealing and focusing on the very urgent issue of the climate crisis. So, how does a community, and particularly a community that is involved in the historic built environment, begin to respond to something as vital as the climate crisis? How should we deal, in inverted commas, with our existing housing and our historic built environment? And really, should we be looking at net zero as our goal for every building? And what is the cost? And I think that's a really important one to look at. So just as a brief introduction, the UK government has committed to at least a 98% reduction in climate change gases compared to 1990 levels by 2030, so in less than 10 years' time. with a 78% reduction by 2035 and eventually net zero by 2050. So actually, how are we going to meet these? Okay, these targets, and actually, how are we going to move forward? But it's very important to remember that what we're looking at here is sustainability, is creating a sustainable future for not only our historic built environment, but for all of us. And probably the most united goals that we have on this is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, one of these are 17 goals that have been brought together to define what makes a sustainable development. And I think that this is a really good time to actually bear this in mind, that climate change is part of this much bigger agenda about creating a sustainable future for us all. But within that, there are particular elements that we must bear in mind. And one of the things that I find quite worrying, that culture is not labelled as one of those core elements within that sustainable development goal. And that's where ICOMOS has a key role. As a UN advisory group on World Heritage, it brings and highlights the importance of how our cultural identity, our cultural sustainability is part of this much wider agenda. Now, there are particular challenges when we're dealing with the historic built environment. Historic buildings are built very differently and behave very differently from modern constructed dwellings in general terms. Historic buildings are generally breathable, what we call porous construction, which allow moisture, air to actually travel through the fabric. And that's how the building is behaved. Now, we've heard recently in the news about Insulate Britain and the need to insulate and lower our carbon emissions. But we have to be very careful on treating historic buildings in the same way that we may deal with a contemporary built structure. So how is an organization, a community or a group of people, or even just someone as a historic homeowner, the example I'm going to use today, going to react to this urgent need to lower carbon emissions, while at the same time understand the economic limitations that are placed upon them and the cultural importance that their buildings represent to the very fabric of the UK society. Because when we're balancing those sustainability requirements, we're also balancing what the building actually needs. And along with doing that, it is what the needs of the user and the limitations that that user has upon the building, be them financial, economic, be them cultural, be them accessibility. And these things are always in balance. And when we are focusing on lowering our carbon emissions, it's really important that we balance all of these out, because there is no point in spending huge amounts of money and huge amounts of capital and on trying to lower just a few more percentages off a historic building, where that capital can be much better spent elsewhere and lower carbon emissions in a much greater way. And we've got to respect our buildings. They are part of our very culture. They are part of our community. They are what identify and bind us together. So when we're balancing all of these out, how are we supposed to move forward? How is a community, how is a group of people involved in protecting a building, be it a PCC at a church level, be it a neighbourhood group, be it a historic homeowner, meant to reach these sustainable goals and lower their carbon emissions? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about today. This is part of this is the outcome of a 10-year research project where we looked at one group of historic buildings, the largest group that we have in the UK, and that is our historic housing stock. And we came up with a new framework for dealing with this group of buildings in the most sustainable way. And what we came up with is something that I think took a lot of people a little bit by surprise. That actually the most sustainable strategy for the historic built environment is via historic building conservation, through maintenance, benign, small improvements and periodical renewals, that was the way forward. And it actually ended up saving huge amounts of energy within the building and actually saved large amounts of carbon. And as well, very importantly for community groups and for homeowners, ended up costing much less than a typical, and I put that in inverted commas, sustainable refurbishment. And I'm going to talk about some of those changes and what we found out. So what are these benign conservation-based changes? Now, we've all heard about solar panels, photovoltaics, large insulation, heat pumps and so forth. But these tend to have an impact on our buildings. So what is it, if we take the ICOMOS guide that came from the Borough Charter, as much as necessary and as little as possible as a way forward? What could we achieve by still preserving the very heritage of our buildings, but still with the requirement to lower energy consumption and carbon emissions? Well, I think it's first to understand actually what we mean by an intervention. When we do a refurbishment, we have an impact upon that building. And that building has, excuse me, an inherent heritage. Now that can be through its use, through the very fabric of the building, and through the visual aspects of heritage. So we have to measure whatever we do to a building against those heritage impact criteria. Now, the use of the building and the use of the material generally stays the same, or we want it to stay the same. We want to preserve it. So we really must to, when we're looking at an intervention, well, we must understand its use. We need to make sure that it's not damaging the fabric of the building and it's not having a large impact on the visual aspects of the heritage. So that is what a benign intervention is. It is something that has low or no impact on the fabric of the building or on the visual heritage of the building. So the example that we looked at was the historic pre-1919 housing stock. Now, this was the largest group of historic buildings in the UK that had no firm sustainable strategy. We now know that it is so urgent that we need to lower our carbon emissions, and particularly in the UK with the world's largest percentage-wise existing built environment. We need to reduce not only the new build, but also what we already have. However, what the research found was the advice for historic homeowners remains ambiguous at best and at worst actually ineffective, and sometimes actually quite damaging to the actual historic fabric of the home. But at the same time, we found out that the pre-1919 housing stock had the highest carbon emissions of any housing group and over twice the maintenance costs compared with modern housing. But what was even more interesting was that there were more than 4.7 million of these dwellings just in England alone. Now, if we equate that between the now and the final 2050 target, that would mean 425 home refurbishments every single day. So whatever we suggest to as a sustainable strategy, it has to be accessible. To deal with 425 refurbishments every day, it has got to be something that is realistic. And that's a really important one, where we have seen scientific studies that have shown that you can turn a Victorian terraced house to a zero carbon standard. The cost, the time, and the impact on the heritage, do they truly make it a sustainable strategy? And that is something that we'll look at today. So what are these benign strategies that we can apply? Well, the first one is getting the basics of conservation right, making sure the building is well maintained, make sure it is used. And these things go back right to the very start of organisations like the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, ICOMOS, and making sure that our heritage and our historic built environment is continued to be used. But what actual changes can we do to the building? Well, the first and the most energy consuming and carbon intensive element of any building is the heating and hot water system. Now, we've known lots of different movements forward on this and different interventions we can take, But actually, just by making sure that our existing system is as efficient as possible can have huge carbon and energy saving benefits. So find out how old the boiler is. If the boiler is more than 15 years old, it is not a condensing boiler or a high efficiency boiler, make sure that that is replaced. Make sure that hot water tank, the hot water pipes and the heating system are insulated. And make sure you've got heating controls. These are all small changes that can have a huge impact on the carbon emissions and the energy usage of a building. While dealing with glazing, make sure that your windows and doors can close properly. The number of historic buildings that we surveyed as part of this research, which had windows that were jammed, doors that weren't draft proofed, they didn't have any seals on, windows that were cracked, it was phenomenal. And these were high level buildings. These weren't just ones in poor condition. So make sure that your windows and your openings are working properly. They are draft proof where possible. If you can insulate, then make sure your insulation is breathable. Allow that historic fabric to behave how it's supposed to. When you come to replace your appliances, think about making sure and focus on making sure they are the most energy efficient. In the end, if we can reduce the amount of energy we need in the first place, that's going to have sustainable benefits. And don't forget, we can put renewables in to historic buildings. It doesn't have to be on the front facade. They can often be hidden away so they don't damage the fabric, so they don't damage the visual heritage of a building, and they can often be installed with very little and often reversible impact on the actual fabric of the building. But a key factor, and one that is ignored by many of the energy modelling programs that are used in the built environment, is the essence of the user's behaviour and educating people on understanding their buildings and how their behaviour can have an impact. Now, as part of this process, what we proposed is actually a process of renewal, of periodic renewal within the built environment. And on the right here on the screen, you can see a timeline of how the heating system can be changed over time. So an existing non-condensing boiler with a poorly insulated hot water tank may be an existing condition. And this is often the case that I find in particularly historic churches, older Victorian properties, particularly with owners who say, well, actually, you know, this boiler's been working for years. I've never had any problems. Why replace it? But actually, by replacing that energy boiler, not with a renewable technology, but with just a new, highly efficient boiler, and making sure the hot water tank is additionally insulated, has a huge impact on the carbon and the greenhouse gas emissions from a building. And then thinking about installing improved heating controls. The easy application of things like smart heating, thermostatic controlled, and even just the making sure that radiators are drained and bled properly, and put in the thermostatic controls on every radiator can again have a significant impact on the energy usage of a building. When the hot water tank comes to be replaced, make sure that it's replaced with a highly insulated hot water tank with multiple heating coils. This allows for future technologies to be easily installed with very little damage or alteration to the building. And then over time, you can be considering adding a secondary heating input. This could be solar thermal, it could be a heat pump, and that can be part of the periodic renewal of a building. And finally, the primary boiler may then become replaced. Boilers generally are replaced about every 15 to 20 years. So between now and 2050, we can expect that even a boiler fitted today will be replaced. And at that time, the cost and the energy efficiency may very well mean that it's a much more accessible intervention within the historic built environment. And if your boiler has multiple heating coils, it can often be added as an additional, a backup and supportive heating system. And again, with very little intervention and impact on the historic building. So what were the energy savings and the carbon emission savings we found? Well, we found by upgrading the loft insulation, we found we had energy savings in our historic buildings from anything between 4 and 30%. Just making sure that the windows were draft proofed and make sure the windows were opening and closing properly, we're between 2 and 10%. And please note that I'm not asking to replace historic windows here with double glazing. They may be installed for other reasons, but actually environmentally, you can achieve a lot by just simply refurbishing existing buildings. Hot water tank insulation up to 75 mil, save between 3 and 8%. And this is what took everyone back. By making sure that their boiler was the most efficient on the market, to save between 16 and 46%. Now, this was a review of a large number of historic dwellings in the UK. And often that cost of replacing a boiler, so much less than a typical sustainable refurbishment, but was saving so much energy and carbon. Heating controls was another shock in the survey. Just by improving the heating controls in a building, making sure that the thermostatic measures were positioned in the right place, in livable rooms rather than in cold entrance halls, saved between 12 and 14%. Energy saving light bulbs, another very typical energy intervention, actually saved less than 1%. And making sure that the floor was insulated whenever alterations were happening, saved between 8 and 14%. Now you add these up, these are huge energy savings with very little impact on the visual heritage of the building or on the fabric of the building. And that is one of the big things that we need to focus on when we're dealing with the historic environment, that not only are we becoming energy efficient, reducing our carbon emissions, but we also begin to develop, preserve our valued cultural heritage. So what is the framework that I use? I've used this slide so many times, and this is what I would always suggest to anybody involved in looking after the historic built environment, and particularly community groups. The first thing is look after your building. One of the most energy efficient ways to preserve any historic building is to ensure its continued and regular maintenance. Make sure you reduce your waste and your energy usage. Okay? Try to make sure that things are turned off properly. Behavior is correct, and it can have a huge impact. As much as 20 or 30% of your energy usage in your building can be achieved just through behavioral changes. And then make your existing system as efficient as possible. Upgrade and replace your heating system. Make sure that all of your energy appliances are the most effective as possible. And then when you've done all of that, begin to start thinking about the more typical sustainable refurbishment elements, such as renewable energies and so forth. Now, one of the other most important and limiting factors in any refurbishment strategy is the cost and the economic cost. What we found in the study was that the main economic factors, particularly for homeowners, were the value of their property, the cost of maintaining and repairing it, and actually reducing their energy bills. These were the key economic factors. Now, what we have to be able to understand is that the economic drivers within sustainability, the homeowner, the community group responsible for looking after historic buildings need to be able to afford whatever we propose. So making it as little as possible, but as much as necessary, is just as important as in energy conservation as it is in preserving our heritage environment. So these benign conservation-based changes ranged in the study buildings between £2,000 and £7,000. Now, for the whole of our historic housing stock, that is still a huge amount of money, between £9 and £32 billion of investment. However, if you compare that with one of the more typical sustainable focused refurbishments of a historic building, that can be between £20,000 and £80,000 a building. That could bring the cost for refurbishing our historic housing stock into the hundreds of billions. Now, bear in mind the UK government has only put aside £13 billion for the refurbishment of all of our housing stock, not just our historic, all of it. This number is something to be thinking about. So you may say, well, why cost is not the issue, the climate is. But the actual issue here is by only spending £7,000, you are getting between 30 and 50% carbon emission reductions and energy savings within a building. However, to get that up to the target can require another £33,000 per building. Now, is that money better spent elsewhere? Now, we know that the sustainable based refurbishments that solely focus on energy reduction has a huge impact on our heritage, on our economic well-being. And I've come to term that difference between what is possible within our refurbishment where we don't impact on the heritage of the building and the targets of what people want to achieve as the carbon value of our heritage. And the question remains to all of us is, can that money, rather than impacting on our historic built environment, be better spent elsewhere in fighting climate change? And I think by looking at the figures on the previous slide, those hundreds of billions of pounds can certainly have a huge impact on our response to the urgent issue of climate change. So I think that while we approach and how communities and how housing owners begin to approach the climate crisis is, what is the carbon value of our heritage? And I would argue that looking after our heritage on our built environment is just as an important part of sustainability as any of the other UN sustainable goals. And with that, I would like to end and say thank you to Clara, and I hope you found the talk informative. If you have any questions or have any comments about it, please do email me or put them in the chat box. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand you back to Clara.